Good evening, I hope you're well. It is a slightly drizzly yet sunny day here on the Oregon coast, and today I'm sitting around thinking about why poetry is important. I'm not going to make any revolutionary talking points. Everything I'm about to say hasn't already been said by somebody far more brilliant than I. I think when people think of poetry, they think of structure. I think in poetry being a form of writing, I think people get too caught up on the form part of it. They think that the importance in poetry lies within its ability to be followed, its ability to be concise, its ability to be coherent and relatable, etc., English teacher talking points, but that isn't true. I know a scary amount of brilliant poets who have never posted their work or put themselves out there out of fear that it simply isn't good enough, it's not valuable, that it doesn't make any sense. That because it doesn't necessarily fit into this form, that it's not poetry, and that it's not worthy. This is an insane level of untrue. The value in poetry does not lie within its structure. You can get you can read the shittiest poem in the world, and it is shitty not because of its structure, but its content. Some things simply don't resonate. The wonderful and insane thing about poetry is that it is everything and everyone. It is the between in which all we see and all we experience. It is a right of expression. It is a form of creativity that will never cease to be. What's that one, like, Lana Del Rey audio where she's like, everybody's a poet? Yeah, to a degree. Now, truth be told, anything literary is ruined by the school system. It's the reason why people don't read as much. It's the reason why people don't write as much. It's the reason why people can only see creative writing and associate it with assignments and grades. So you are not alone in thinking that the counter argument of there is no use in poetry, or that it's simply an art form that not everybody possesses the talent for. You're in your right to think of it that way, because that is the way that it has been taught. Especially because mostly in school we're taught about Old English poets, where it's the dead white guy dilemma. And if you've ever taken a poetry class in high school, you know that your grade relies less on your interpretation of the poem and more about identifying beat and structure and theme. Things that are already set in stone, things that are from textbooks. Now, going back to what I previously said, the value in poetry is actually in the interpretation and the fact that it is all around us. I've always thought that the dictionary definition of poetry simply isn't enough. It does not encompass all that is poetry. Poetry isn't always necessarily writing. There's spoken word, there's performance. Some people are poets in just the way they are, in the way they exist in the world. That too is a form of poetry. The value of poetry then, to me at least, is how easily accessible it is. It is the most widely accessible form of creative expression there is. You can't paint without a brush and a canvas or some paper. You can't draw without a pencil or a notebook, but you can be a poet. But that craft is accessible, and it's everywhere. There are simply people in the world who have more an affinity to it. There are people who are blessed with the vocabulary and the effort and the drive to put in the work to describe the world around them as beautiful as they do. There are people who have more of a grasp on their emotions, who are able to describe it in these complex yet relatable ways. Like, don't get me wrong, there are good poets and there are bad poets, but above all else, there are poets. And I know I'm gonna get a lot of shit for this. I know that there's going to be some tweed jacket bubble glasses fucker telling me that poetry as a craft is specifically this and this and this. But my problem with that is that poetry is not an accumulation of traits and things. Poetry is not the fact that you dress in tweed and read Donna Tartt. Poetry is not the fact that you own a fountain pen. Poetry is not your leather moleskin journal. It is not a list of things. It is not something that has any sort of price tag on it or any sort of aesthetic. It is not something that comes as a sort of prerequisite for a certain kind of person. Poetry is what you make of it, what you make of the world around you, and how well you perform it. That in itself is valuable. And I make this video because I really struggle with aesthetics like dark academia and all sorts of things. And again, I'm fully expecting the myriad of people telling me that I'm a hater because some people want to romanticize their school experience. I never said you couldn't do that, but it is damn silly of you to sit here and tell me that this fetishy Eurocentric agenda of writing and writers and poetry and poets being some sort of stylized movie character that you put on your Pinterest board. Like, you can't sit here and tell me that that doesn't take the soul out of being a poet, out of poetry. And while that may go against my notion that everything is poetry and anybody could be a poet, again, it is how well you work it. Even the person who's doing shitty written poetry is more of a poet than the person who takes up the hobby of intellectually posturing for Tumblr. By no means am I calling myself an intellectual by saying this too. I don't think that I have a better grasp on poetry than anybody. I don't think I'm better than anybody. But I am an observer. And I think that I can do pretty damn well at deciphering who is maybe more inclined to poetry versus the aesthetic of poetry. The aesthetic of poetry. Poetry aesthetic. Look up poetry aesthetic on Pinterest. How does that not make you nauseous? Like, what am I looking at? I'm looking at someone's fucking grocery list being written in a fountain pen and then desaturated. Maybe actually, wait, that could be poetry if you put a twist on it. And to loop back to our original point, why read poetry? Because it is the rawest form of self-expression that you can read. Poetry is a need for us as a society, not only because of the storytelling aspect, but because of the fact that we are able to document this form of expression as a pivotal way to understand each other. It's important to know too that poetry is music. Music is poetry. Music is poetry with synth and sound and beat. And there is no argument to why music is an important part of human nature. And there shouldn't be an argument as to why poetry is an important part of human nature. In the same way that we value journaling and we vouch for journaling, poetry is that to me as well. Poetry is up there with importance. Honing the skills to express yourself in any which way. So aside from how it values society, personally, we're moving on to personal value now. Poetry, being the most raw way to express yourself, is how you best sharpen your own ego. I know when people hear the word fucking ego, never mind the word ego, it's how you best sharpen your personhood, your human experience. The easiest way to find who you are is to write it out, to speak it out loud, to perform. All of these things, all of these movements, all of these factors of whatever, they all fall into self-expression, and they all are a pivotal part of what makes us individuals, of what gives us a unique sense of styles, and what gives us a unique sense of taste. And most importantly, it is what deepens the understanding of oneself. Other than that, it's just a pleasant thing to partake in. It's a pleasant thing to read. It's a pleasant thing to discuss. It's invigorating. It's stimulating. Have you ever tried reading poetry until 4 a.m.? Have you ever tried it? I highly recommend it. Have you ever read poetry in the waning hours of twilight? No? Then don't tell me nothing. But to wrap up my incoherent rambles, I hope that I got my point across, and I hope that's inspired at least one of you to pick up the habit of being a poet. This isn't necessarily a how-to guide. This is simply me explaining why it is important, why you should do it, and why it's necessary. All of which were chopped up into fucking which ways. Yeah, no, this didn't have any sort of coherent step to it, but I enjoyed making the video, and I hope that you enjoyed watching it. And I'll see you next time.